For those with a surface-level understanding of Marxism and Soviet culture, advertising, as well as consumerism, may seem antithetical to Soviet socialism. Following the fall of the Soviet Union, Western advertising agencies who sought to profit in the former USSR were surprised to find that their assumptions concerning the Soviet Union having no advertising culture prior to 1988 were ill-founded. In fact, not only did advertising exist in the Soviet world, but it had a distinctly socialistic character. Advertising was present in the Soviet Union since its inception, initially to sell the political program of Bolshevism to the masses. As time progressed, the selling of consumer products became a facet of Soviet life. The Cold War fostered narratives of a bipolar world with two competing systems, American capitalism versus Soviet socialism. However, Marxism, the ideological foundation of the Soviet state, is dialectical. In essence, the best of all previous historical epochs would be embodied in socialist and ultimately communist culture. If the Soviet Union's political project was to put Marxism into practice, then characteristics of capitalism, the historical period predating socialism, needed to be present in Soviet socialist order, albeit in a form reflecting Soviet socialism's ideals. The political realities of Cold War competition with the United States, as well as the need to provide Soviet citizens with material comforts after decades of hardship and austerity, spurred Soviet state planners to provide citizens with something akin to a middle-class living standard. This paper will survey consumer advertising in Soviet Union and its periphery, arguing that rather than being an ironic contradiction within socialism, Soviet consumerism was rather a consistent element of Soviet culture that showed its citizenry an idealized vision of life under communism. In 1928, American godfather of the public relations industry, Edward Bernays, viewed propaganda as the critical element in selling ideas and consumer goods. Since taking power in 1917, the Bolsheviks used propaganda to sell themselves and their ideology to the Russian masses. Throughout the Russian Civil War, a cornucopia of avant-garde posters trumpeted the Bolshevik Party's worldview concerning Russia as a country undergoing its revolutionary destiny while being led by Lenin and the Bolsheviks, the alleged true voice of Marxism. For example, a 1920 photomontage by Gustav Klotzis entitled Electrification of the Entire Country takes a cutout picture of a striding Lenin standing over a monochrome cubist drawing of an electric plant with workers cheering from the top, shown on the left. A 1921 Linokut, drawn by Vladimir Kozlinsky, evokes the Christian theology of apocalypse with an Art Deco drawing of a revolutionary carrying a waving red flag under the heading, "The dead of the Paris Commune have risen under the banner of the Soviets," shown on the right. A notable feature of many 1920s Soviet advertisements was the use of constructivist, abstract graphic design. Soviet constructivism artistically reflected the goals of the Soviet project. These goals included the building of a striking future by the working class, a stereotypically simplistic, yet heroic group destined to complete history as envisioned by Marxists. This led to the experimental use of basic three-dimensional shapes contrasted against simple lines and photographic or realistically rendered images collages in early advertisements. This technique can be seen in Grigory and Vladimir Steenberg's 1928 advertisement for the All-Russian Photographic Joint Stock Company. Once the Bolsheviks largely consolidated power, following the Russian Civil War in 1921, private businesses were allowed to function under, or in conjunction with, the state economy under the new economic policy NEP of the Bolshevik Party. The advertising of consumer goods began to be a cultural dimension of Soviet Russia. However, allowing a budding consumer culture to exist was controversial within the Bolshevik Party. Debates occurred over adopting a cultural model of socialism free of any elements of capitalism versus a more economically pragmatic socialist model, with Lenin favoring the later view. For example, in 1922, during the 11th Party Congress, a debate between Bolshevik intellectual David Ryazanov and Lenin occurred over whether Pravda, the official party newspaper, should allow advertising from non-state entities in its pages. Ryazanov held the view that advertising, in principle, was a remnant of pre-revolutionary bourgeois culture which should not have a place in the party's newspaper of record. Lenin, however, viewed advertising as an efficient means to fund Pravda in the economically precarious times following the Russian Civil War. Lenin's view naturally won out. However, if advertising consumer goods was to be a fixture of socialist life, it would have to be a tool that strengthened rather than subverted the Soviet project. Soviet advertising agencies grew out of state newspapers and other party organs. Ultimately, the content of Soviet advertising was to exist within the framework of strengthening the Soviet economy while propagandizing for Soviet social engineering projects. The agitational goals of Soviet advertising were to show the superiority of the public over private sector, build relations between social classes under Soviet hegemony, and show consumption as a path to modernization. In the case of competition between the public and private sector, fears concerning the cultural power of the post-war petit bourgeois were reflected in advertisements. The goal of the Soviet state was to maintain and expand its power while transforming Russia into Marx's vision of a secular, industrialized proletarian state. For the Bolsheviks, this meant that the vestiges of what they considered pre-socialist peasantry's rural culture, as well as small-scale capitalists, NEP men and kulaks, needed to be ushered out by the power of the Bolshevik dictatorship of the proletariat. One way to achieve this goal was to use ads to shape public opinion. For example, one 1924 advertisement for a state food trust depicts a skinny customer with money falling from his coat being squeezed between a NEP man and kulak, both fat and counting money. Advertising needed to convey a sense of relief and material recovery following the years of violence, death, and famine that dominated life during the period of war communism. Furthermore, it was hoped that showcasing consumer goods to the peasantry would give them a more cultured, modern character, while, at the same time, urging them to produce more agricultural resources for sale in Soviet cities which produced the goods advertised. For instance, a 1926 advertisement for State Syndicate Selmash depicts a young, clean-shaven peasant with his arm heroically extended to an older, bearded peasant to show him the wonders of an automatic tractor. Another print advertisement from 1926, filled with the imagery of the cultured rural outsider, depicts a Cossack man holding a bottle of wine, under the caption, "There are no better wines and cognacs than those of Dogsel Kredit Soyuz." As the 1920s drew to a close and the 1930s began, Stalinism became a way of life in the Soviet Union, and the artistic style and content of Soviet advertising changed. In Stalin's Russia, the concrete and the abstract were often at odds with one another. Massive industrialization and collectivization projects framed themselves as a necessary and heroic dash towards building socialism in the Soviet Union. As St. Petersburg was said to be built on bones, according to the old Russian adage, so was Stalinist modernization in unprecedented levels. However, while day-to-day life in Stalin's Russia was a mixture of mass-based revolutionary optimism, as well as apocalyptic misery, consumer art reflected a vision of the ideals and goals of Stalin's Soviet Union. According to Brezhnev-era Soviet author N.N. Schneidman, literature in Stalinist Russia reflected how things should be, as opposed to how they really were. The same can be said of advertising. The fantasy aspect of Stalinist advertising was balanced by socialist realist art, which emphasized sophistication, Western fashion, and abundance. Under Stalin, one of the central goals of NEP-era Soviet advertising, the state's desire to show the superiority of the public sector over the private, had ended. NEP and NEP men and kulaks were no longer a reality due to economic restructuring as well as political terror. Now the state was the only source for consumer goods. Advertisements of the Stalin period represented the ideal of what the state could provide and the citizenry could achieve through hard work. Stalin-era advertising emphasized comfort within the private space of the home, as well as an idealized portrayal of Soviet life. The focus on private leisure was a distinction from the content of NEP-era advertising, which was often political in content, diverse in art style, and occurring in public space. At the height of political terror in 1938, Soviet cinema and advertising were filled with harmonious content. Stalin's favorite film, Volga-Volga, was a comedy musical set along the Volga River. Its plot consisted of a plucky band of singers led by an indomitable female postal worker seeking to perform at a music festival in Moscow. The escapist content and idealized tone of Stalin-era mass culture provided a break from the grueling public space of the period filled with famine, five-year plans, political terror, and show trials. In a 1930s advertisement for canned crab meat, a modestly but well-dressed housewife eats from an ornate crab dish, remarking how delicious and delicate her meal tastes. Another ad shows a bottle of vodka as wine glasses emerge from a vanishing point. The trend of using Western fashion and the ideal of a high living standard continued into the post-war Stalin era. A 1950 advertisement for champagne from the People's Commissariat of the food and wine industry shows a sophisticated woman enjoying a sparkling glass of champagne in front of an ornate glass filled with grapes. Within Soviet consumer culture was not only the vision of socialist comfort and abundance, but also a long-standing Russian pursuit of the West. For Peter the Great, St. Petersburg was to be the modern Russian city, based on Western architectural design. It was to symbolize Russia as being modern and cultured. For Joseph Stalin, American industrial city, Gary, Indiana, served as a model for Magnitogorsk, a state-planned industrial city placed in the Ural Mountains. For Khrushchev, the Western ideal and consumerism became ever more intertwined on the political stage of the Cold War. His 1956 speech at the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union denounced Stalin's personality cult, which emphasized a romantic vision over a brutal reality. Khrushchev's task as general secretary was for socialism and communism to materialize, rather than be a far-off goal under his leadership. This was not simply an idealistic goal, but also a political necessity. In the wake of de-Stalinization, since political riots in Poland and the Hungarian uprising of 1956 necessitated that the scars of Stalinism be salved with better living standards. Stalin-era advertising showed an ideal of middle-class consumption and comfort under the communist flag. Khrushchev was to take this vision from poster art to living room comfort. Khrushchev looked to American consumer technology to build the model socialist home. Russia's imperial and Soviet history of looking to the West as a source of modernity and culture provided Khrushchev with a precedent to Sovietize the best of American consumer comfort. The idea that the Soviet Union could catch up to the West in terms of domestic comfort was not far-fetched. The previous decades of the 1930s and 40s saw the Soviet Union at tremendous cost of life modernize its economy, industrialize, and defeat Nazi Germany. In his famous 1959 kitchen debate at the American National Exhibition in Sokolniki Park in Moscow with then Vice President Richard Nixon, Khrushchev stated, "We always knew that Americans were smart people. Stupid people could not have risen to the economic level that they've reached. But as you know, we don't beat flies with our nostrils. In 42 years, we've made progress." In his 1961 speech at the 22nd CPSU Congress, Khrushchev stressed the need for the communist stage of history to become a way of life in the Soviet Union within 20 years. Part of the actualization of communism for Khrushchev was for the Soviet Union to have the world's highest living standard, a moniker often attributed to the United States by its political and economic leaders. Khrushchev stated, "The CPSU is advancing a great task to achieve in the coming 20 years a living standard higher than that of any capitalist country, and to create the necessary conditions for achieving an abundance of material and cultural values." He went on to stress, by the end of the first 10 years, all sectors of the Soviet people will enjoy plenty and will be well provided for. Communism will thereby demonstrate its decisive advantages over capitalism in a manner which directly concerns everybody without exception. One manner in which living standards were to be raised was for the state to invest in department stores, thus creating a stage for communist consumption. During Stalin's tenure, Moscow's closest approximation to a shopping mall, GUM, Cyrillic abbreviation for State Universal Store, located in Red Square, was converted into a headquarters for bureaucratic offices. Under Khrushchev's administration, GUM was remodeled and restored into a shopping center. Throughout NEP, GUM was stocked largely with stationary supplies. However, the Khrushchev period saw GUM host a multi-floor trading hall featuring textiles, ready-made clothes, shoes, knitted and linen goods, kitchenware, household goods, furniture and rugs, furs and headwear, stationery and toys, recreational goods. As in other forms of Soviet commercial advertising, the department store and shopping mall served the function of being a space for celebration of what Soviet socialism was achieving as much as it served a practical function. In essence, the Soviet shopping center was designed to offer the proletarian the best capitalism could offer, but with socialist morality, namely abundance that aided in the happiness of working classes' day-to-day life. This method existed not only in the Soviet states, but in the Eastern Bloc countries as well, notably in Eastern Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. Continuing the trend present in Stalin-era advertising, women were featured in the foreground of the consumption process. Women were cast in the role of the lead proletarian consumer, as well as the focal point of socialist aesthetic beauty in the realm of consumption. Not only were women often the focal point of advertisements, but they were actively targeted by department store owners to be the catalyst of socialist consumption. In Patrick Hyder-Patterson's article, Risky Business, What Was Really Being Sold in Department Stores of Socialist Eastern Europe, the director of the Hungarian department store Scala stated that the layout of the department store was designed to draw women into the back of the store, where the women's section was placed. Following her purchase on herself, it was speculated that she would feel the need to buy for her husband and children as she walked through the men's and children's department in order to exit the store. If a woman comes into a department store, she begins by looking to see what kind of new items for women there are. When she comes back, she finds herself with a feeling of guilt about the purchase she made. This has to be gotten rid of. How? She buys something for her children in the children's section and something for her husband in menswear. The dawn of television in the Soviet Union in the 1960s allowed advertisers to apply the principles of socialist consumerism to an audiovisual canvas, a practice that continued until the fall of communism. From the late 1960s through 80s, Soviet commercial advertising was often vibrant in color, clever in content, and composed of a variety of directorial techniques. Soviet as well as Eastern Bloc, commercials were not competitive or derogatory towards other products. Rather, commercials were designed to bring pleasure to the viewers simply by viewing the ad. For example, prolific Estonian commercial director Harry Egypt, whose works exemplified Soviet pop culture advertisement, stated of his commercials, selling a product was not as important as the entertainment value, thus making the ads themselves the product to be consumed. One of Egypt's commercials for Penguin ice cream emphasized the role ice cream could bring in providing happiness and relaxation to Soviet citizens. The jingle sang, "To bring strength and perk in your soul, lower tension in your mind console. The only answer is right here, ice cream penguin." Television commercials generally ran between a minute to a minute and a half. In Hungary, commercials could run in the 20-second range. Often, commercial advertising merged with public service, making viewers aware either of the benefits of the socialist system or telling viewers where they could learn a valuable trade. For instance, a 1970s advertisement for the Russian police featured a peppy jingle with the refrain, "People of the law know what they want," as police heroically walked through the city, greeting citizens before returning to the police station to use photo technology to study the faces of criminals. An Estonian commercial from the early to mid-1980s, directed by Egypt for Cindy Trade School No. 7, showcased beautiful young women in bold 1980s fashion. Working with sewing machines as an energetic synthesizer chimed, and lyrics encouraged viewers to see both the fun and challenge of being a seamstress. Another of Egypt's commercials, this time for Baltic Textile Factory 35 in Tallinn, featured a fashionable young Russian woman named Lena, who spoke of the interesting work, good pay, and a factory daycare center for young mothers. The commercial utilized video montage, showing Lena frolicking in a bathing suit, riding an amusement park ride, and working behind an industrial loom. Soviet commercials also trumpeted shopping centers, as well as consumer goods. These commercials often had messages that showcased the abundance of socialism or showed how products could bring greater comfort to the socialist lifestyle. For example, a commercial directed by Egypt for the Leningrad shopping mall featured the faces of beautiful models wearing high 1980s fashion while spinning in circles to soothing and energetic synthesizer music, followed by the message, "Welcome to the Leningrad shopping mall." Egypt directed another commercial for the mall, featuring the wide array of fabric assortments they offered as glamorous women danced in dresses made from the fabric that was sold. A commercial for the video center of Tallinn featured teenagers at a dance party, followed by close-ups of teens asking for films such as Platoon and Emmanuel on Taboo Island. Commercials which featured household goods often emphasized how the products being sold could bring comfort, culture, and happiness to those in the home. A television ad for Estonian consumer cooperative Home Supplies. Wholesale marketing featured costumed female contortionists performing on carpets and tables filled with fine china. The singer of the jingle sang lines such as, "It's possible to eat from clay, I'll choose china if I may," as well as, "A workday's gray and so's the sky, crystal helps you still get by." Luxury goods, that's what it's for, to keep your life from being a bore. A 1970s Russian commercial for the Fnost. 402 portable 11-inch television showed a father and son bonding in the side room, watching the boxing match while the mother of the house watched her program on the living room television. Household advertisements, at times, featured over-the-top comedic themes. A Hungarian ad for a portable cassette player featured a young man talking. However, as he continued, his words began to skip, and eventually cassette tape ribbon spooled from his mouth. Following this, his appearance changed and he spoke clearly, despite being rotated around the screen and sat on. Then he held up the advertised cassette player. Despite the emphasis on women in the consumption process, places in the domestic sphere, such as the kitchen, were not defined as a strictly female space. Another Russian ad for Toilex air freshener featured a young man cooking a multi-course meal. The narrator for the commercial commented that the smell of fish, potatoes, Ukrainian borscht, and coffee were appetizing, but when their smells combined, it was better to smell Toilex air freshener. A commercial for corn featured dancing ears and cans of corn speaking to a singing male chef. Following the exchange, an array of corn dishes were shown across the screen. The aesthetic of female nudity was present in several commercials from communist countries, notably Estonia and Hungary. Egypt stated of his work, "My clips demonstrated that Soviet Estonians are not afraid of capitalist glamour like socialist glamour, nor young and beautiful dancing girls, nor other beautiful naked girls." This element of Soviet commercial culture was in contradiction with American advertising's portrayal of the Soviet woman. A Wendy's fast food commercial from 1985 portrayed a drab hall filled with commissars attending a fashion show. At several points throughout, the announcer proclaimed day wear, evening wear, swimwear. However, every outfit was a gray smock worn by the same overweight woman, the only change being a flashlight as a prop for evening wear and a beach ball for swimwear. Many of Egypt's ads, on the other hand, used glamour and female nudity as a focal point, which sold socialist abundance and culture. In a commercial for Mistra carpets, as well as Estonian perfumeries, nude women were featured in statuesque poses on ornate carpets and bathing in the middle of a well-stocked department store. Hungarian commercials from the 1980s utilized near-female nudity along with comedy in order to sell products. For instance, an ad for Mulatto coffee depicts a portly office worker taking a sip of coffee only to have the taste of the drink cause him to see dancing, thong-clad women in a beach setting. U.S. Family sitcoms of the mid to late 20th century, such as Leave It to Beaver, showed American television viewers an ideal of happiness, harmony, and abundance on a media canvas. The commercial advertising of the Soviet Union and communist Eastern Europe portrayed something similar. Soviet commercials showed what communism had produced as well as what it strived to achieve: culture, power, and abundance. While the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc countries never achieved the level of consumer abundance that its Western rivals did, they nevertheless did build something approximating a middle-class living standard for its obedient citizens. Those citizens developed a taste for consumer comforts within a Soviet framework. While many in the United States may view the communist world as a drab, monolithic state with no mass culture, aside from propaganda posters, Soviet advertising portrayed a much different vision of socialism, one in which the colorful abundance of a consumer economy walked hand in hand with socialist culture towards the promised future of communism. Bibliography: Byrne, Paulina. Neuberger, Mary ed. Communism Unwrapped. Consumption in Cold War. Eastern Europe. Patrick Hyder Patterson. Risky Business. What was really being sold in department stores of socialist Eastern Europe. Oxford University Press. 2012. Bernays, Edward. Propaganda. Brooklyn, New York. 1928. Chernyshova, Natalia. Soviet Consumer Culture in the Brezhnev Era. Routledge, London, New York. 2013. Dickerman, Leah, ed. Building the Collective, Soviet Graphic Design 1917-1937, Princeton Architectural Press. Dobrenko, Evgeny, Eric Naiman, ed. The Landscape of Stalinism, The Art and Ideology of Soviet Space, Cox, Randy. All This Can Be Yours, Soviet Commercial Advertising in the Construction of Space, University of Washington Press. Egypt, Harry. Retro Soviet TV Commercials, 1979-1989, DVD 2008. Gan, Ramet. Soviet Advertising 1930s, link. Helbeck, Jochen. Revolution on My Mind, Writing a Diary Under Stalin. Harvard University Press, 2006. History of Gumlink. Hickson, Walter. Parting the Curtain, Propaganda, Culture, and the Cold War. Saint, Martin's Press, 1997. Hoberman, J. Red Atlantis, Communist Culture in the Absence of Communism. Temple University, 1998. Kyer, Christina. Newman, Eric. Ed. Cox, Randy. Everyday Life in Soviet Russia. NEP Without NEP Men. Indiana University Press. Kazyavki. Поющая кукуруза. Первая реклама в СССР. Link. Khrushchev, Nikita. Documents of the 22nd Congress of the CPSU. The World Situation. The Construction of Communism in the USSR. The Role of the Communist Party. Cross Currents Press, 1961. Khrushchev, Nikita. Speech at 20th Congress of CPSU, link. Kotkin, Stephen. Magnetic Mountain, Stalinism as a Civilization. University of California, 1995. Machnik, Pete. 101 Hungarian ads from the 80s, 37-101, link. Mashnik, Pete. 101 Hungarian ads from the 80s, 44-101, link. Nixon, Richard. Khrushchev, Nikita. Kitchen Debate, link. Saatchi, Russia. Stewart's Choice, the most interesting Soviet advertising, link. 3 oranges. Wendy's commercial, Soviet fashion show, link. The SMS studio, Sovietskaya reklama, Yunus Chirudu, link. Toon Jason, interview with Harry Egypt, 2013. Link. Wall Wendy, inventing the American way. The politics of consensus from the New Deal to the Civil Rights Movement. Oxford University Press. 2008. Wells Grisenko, Ludmila. Western Concepts, Russian Perspectives, Meanings of Advertising in the Former Soviet Union, Journal of Advertising, Vol. 23, Known International Advertising, MAR. 1994.